It began with a whisper. A nurse I'd never seen before stepped into my path, her eyes too calm for the chaos around us, and said, "Hide now. Trust me." 30 seconds later, I was pressed against a supply room door, watching my supposedly dying husband sit up and smile for another woman as they calmly discussed how and when they were going to kill me. If you're here, stay with me. Because everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and safety died in that hallway. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I was 64 years old and by most accounts living the dream. A girl from a nowhere town in Wyoming who clawed her way into Denver's skyline, I'd turned crumbling buildings into a real estate empire worth $37 million. Not bad for someone who once had to choose between paying rent and paying the electric bill. I knew how to spot opportunity in broken things, old apartment complexes, forgotten blocks, strip malls clinging to life. What I didn't realize, racing down the sterile corridor of Denver General that Tuesday afternoon, was that the most broken thing in my life was the man I thought I loved. My heels hit the polished floor like a metronome counting down to disaster. Richard had been in the ICU for 3 days after what the doctors called a severe cardiac episode. 3 days of monitors beeping, white coats murmuring, and me sitting at his bedside, holding his limp hand, believing my husband of 5 years was fighting for his life. Or so I thought. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent decades renovating structures other people had given up on, and yet my marriage, the one thing I thought was solid, was already a ruin. I just hadn't seen the cracks. I was a few steps from room 314 when she stepped into my path. Mrs. Thompson. A young nurse with tired eyes and brown hair scraped back into a bun blocked the doorway. Her badge read, Sarah Collins, RN. There was something in her expression that made my stomach twist. "Is Richard worse?" I blurted, feeling my heartbeat slam against my ribs. The doctor said he was stable this morning. Sarah's gaze flicked down the corridor, then back to me. "I need to speak with you privately," she whispered. Before I could argue, her fingers closed around my arm with surprising strength. "Hide now. Trust me." And then I was being pushed through a side door into a supply room that smelled of disinfectant and linen. My back pressed against a shelf of neatly folded blankets. I hadn't even found my voice to protest when Sarah eased the door almost shut, leaving a thin sliver of light. Through the narrow crack, I saw her slip away just as another woman appeared, walking straight into Richard's room as if it belonged to her. She was beautiful in a way that made you instantly aware of your age. Honey blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, makeup flawless despite it being around 3 p.m., and a red dress I knew cost more than most people's monthly rent. I know the price of things. It's how I built my life. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who felt entitled to the space she occupied her heels, silent on the glossy floor as she approached my husband's bed. And then Richard spoke, clearly, smoothly, in a voice I hadn't heard in days. "Sophia, darling, you shouldn't be here during visiting hours," he murmured, like a man mildly inconvenienced, not one hooked up to machines. The world tilted sideways. Sophia. Who the hell was Sophia? I felt my fingers dig into the doorframe so hard my knuckles ached. She laughed softly, that breathy practice sound young women use when they know they're being watched. I couldn't wait any longer, she purred. The lawyers confirmed everything. Once the transfer papers are signed, all her assets will be in your name only. My assets, my name, my life. The words slid under my skin like ice. I listened as Richard, my husband, the man I had sat beside for 3 days crying into hospital tissues, asked calmly, and the hospital records Sophia's tone turned businesslike. Perfect. Dr. Martinez was very accommodating once we explained the situation. Your recovery will be miraculous, but will require extended care. Maggie will be so focused on taking care of you, she won't notice the business transfers until it's too late. Richard chuckled. He actually chuckled. $37 million, he said, and she'll hand it over gladly to make sure I get the best care. My mind flashed back to that conversation 5 years earlier over candlelight and expensive wine, when I'd suggested we sign a prenup. Even then, I already had several properties and wanted to protect what I'd built. Richard had looked so wounded, so offended when he'd said true love doesn't need legal protection. I'd let the papers sit in a drawer unsigned because I mistook manipulation for romance. Now, hearing him repeat the story to another woman, what prenup I told Maggie it was too unromantic made bile rise in my throat. Sophia's voice turned colder, sharpening like a knife. So once you're recovered, you'll have access to everything. The properties, the business accounts, the investment portfolio. And with her signature on the medical proxy forms, she paused and I heard a rustle of paper. I can make decisions about her care when she inevitably has her own accident. The word hung in the air like a drop of poison. Accident. Nothing dramatic. Richard replied, his tone casual, almost bored. But wives who lose their fortunes to medical expenses often become depressed. Suicidal even. Very sad, really. That was the moment the blood in my veins turned to ice water. They weren't just planning to rob me. They were planning to kill me and dress it up as grief. My hand flew to my mouth, pressing hard to hold back the scream, clawing its way up my throat. 5 years of marriage, and the man I thought I'd grow old with was casually outlining my murder with his 20-something mistress in a hospital room I'd been sobbing in for days. I don't know how long I stood there shaking, listening to the rest. The timeline. The mention of my house in Malibu, the one I'd secretly bought as a 5th anniversary surprise spoken about, as if it already belonged to them. By the time footsteps approached and Sarah slipped back into the supply room, my heart wasn't broken. It was scorched. She put a finger to her lips and whispered, "Come with me." As she led me through an unseen back corridor toward a break room at the end of the hall, one thought burned through the shock. The woman who had walked into this hospital as a devoted, grieving wife had just died in that supply closet. The woman walking out was someone entirely different, and Richard had no idea who he'd just created. Sarah and I didn't speak until we were inside the tiny break room at the end of the hallway, the door locked behind us with a soft click that sounded louder than any slammed door. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I sank into a plastic chair, my legs suddenly useless. "How long have you known?" I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Sarah leaned against the counter, her hands trembling just enough to betray how shaken she was. 2 weeks. She said quietly. "I've been his nurse since he was admitted." At first I thought she was his daughter or a family friend, but the way they touched each other, the way they talked when they thought no one was listening. She shook her head. "Yesterday I accidentally saw some documents she brought, legal papers with your name on them. That's when I knew something was very wrong. I studied her properly then, kind eyes ringed with exhaustion lines on a face too young to have them. 'Why are you helping me?' I asked. She hesitated, then said, 'Because I know what it feels like to be betrayed by someone you trust, and because I have a son. If anything ever happened to me, I'd want someone to look out for him. What they're planning, Mrs. Thompson, it's evil.' We sat there for a moment in a silence so heavy it felt physical. 'What do you think I should do?' I finally asked, because for the first time in a long time I didn't have a ready-made plan. Sarah gave me a small, fierce smile. 'I think your husband and his girlfriend are about to discover they underestimated the wrong woman.' Something in me snapped back into place at those words. Not the old version of me, the one who softened her edges to make a man comfortable, but the woman who once negotiated a multi-million-dollar deal, while her first husband told her she'd never make it without him. I drove home in a daze, Denver's afternoon traffic blurring around me while Sarah's words echoed in my head. My house in Cherry Hills Village sat on 3 acres of manicured perfection, the kind of property real estate agents dream about. I had bought it 15 years earlier when it was an outdated 70s ranch and turned it into something worthy of magazine covers. Richard always loved to brag about our home, but walking through the front door that day, I saw it with new eyes. This wasn't ours. It was mine, my money, my vision, my work. He had contributed opinions and a signature. I had contributed everything else. I poured 3 fingers of the 18-year-old Macallan he kept for special occasions and decided surviving an attempted murder definitely counted. As the whiskey burned down my throat, my phone buzzed with a text. Feeling a bit better today, the message read, "Doctor says you shouldn't worry about visiting tonight. Rest up, darling. Love you. Love you too." I typed back, then muttered into the quiet kitchen, "You lying, cheating, murderous bastard." The burn from the whiskey was nothing compared to the fire building in my chest. I did what I've always done when life tried to knock me down. I opened my laptop. Colorado was a community property state. That meant 5 years of marriage gave him a legal claim to plenty, but only if I died without a plan and without a fight. I was alive, furious, and very good at strategy. First call the divorce attorney who had turned my friend Helen's cheating ex into a financial cautionary tale. Margaret Winters's office. Her secretary answered crisply. "I need an emergency consultation," I said, "today. It's about a divorce case worth $37 million. There was a pause, then a change in tone. "Can you be here by 8 p.m., she asked. "I'll pay double her usual rate." 5 minutes later, my appointment was confirmed. Next, I called my accountant, James Morrison, the man who had quietly watched my empire grow for 12 years. "James, I need you to freeze all joint accounts immediately and move everything you can into accounts Richard cannot touch," I said, pacing my kitchen. "Maggie, what's happening?" "Is Richard all right?" he asked. "Let's just say I'm about to be very single and I'd prefer not to fund my own murder," I replied. "You'll have documentation by tomorrow. For now, just freeze everything. He's in the hospital. He won't notice for a day or 2. After a long beat, James said, "Consider it done." My third call was to Sarah. "I've been thinking about what you said I told her, about them underestimating me. I need to know exactly what they're planning and when." She sounded scared but determined. "I can listen, but if they find out I'm helping you, they won't," I cut in, then added more gently. "And when this is over, I want to offer you something better. I'm going to have properties that need managing, and I'm going to need someone I can trust. Someone with a son who should never have to worry about college tuition." There was a stunned pause, then a shaky laugh. "What kind of salary are we talking about?" she asked. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of my old self. "The kind that changes your life," I said. By the time I walked into Margaret Winter's office that evening, the shock had hardened into something sharp. Margaret looked exactly like a woman who ate liars for breakfast. Tailored suit, cool eyes walls lined with framed victories. Tell me everything she said, and I did every whispered word in that hospital room, every forged document, every chilling mention of my suicide. She listened, took notes, and when I finished, she leaned back and said, "The good news is they haven't stolen anything yet. The bad news is they're clearly about to try. We get ahead of them. We file for divorce before they transfer a cent, expose the medical fraud, and make sure that when this is over, your husband wishes he had never been born." I met her gaze and said, "Margaret, I've spent 40 years building things and tearing them down. I am absolutely prepared for a fight." The next morning I woke up with a clarity that felt almost electric. There's a strange kind of energy that comes from knowing someone tried to kill you and realizing you're still here. I dressed in my navy Armani suit, the one that made people assume I could buy and sell them, poured myself coffee, and checked the time. It was 9:30 a.m. when my phone rang. Sarah's voice came through tight with panic. "Mrs. Thompson, they moved up their timeline. Sophia is bringing the lawyer today at 2 p.m. I stared at the clock. 4.5 hours. Sarah, I need you to delay them, I said. Missing paperwork, sudden tests, whatever you can think of. You're a nurse, be creative, but do not put yourself in danger. When I hung up, I called Margaret. We need to file this morning, I told her. They're trying to transfer everything today. She didn't miss a beat. Meet me at the courthouse in an hour, she said. Your husband is about to have a very bad afternoon. The Denver County Courthouse rose out of the morning haze like a fortress built to contain the sins of men who thought they could outsmart justice. Its marble columns gleamed in the sunlight as I strode toward the entrance heels, clicking with a rhythm that sounded nothing like panic. It was purpose. Margaret was waiting for me at the steps, briefcase in hand, her hair tied back with military precision. Ready to ruin your husband's day, she asked. I adjusted my sunglasses, the corners of my mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. Margaret, I've been ready for 5 years. I just didn't know it. Filing for divorce should feel like the end of something, but in that courthouse with the echo of paper stamps and the smell of old wood polish, it felt like a beginning. The clerk processed everything quickly, her face soft with sympathy when she handed over the official documents. He'll be served this afternoon, Margaret said as we stepped into the bright daylight. Once that happens, he can't move a dime without court approval. I exhaled slowly as if releasing years of denial. And the fraud. The district attorney's office is interested, she replied, especially in the medical aspect. Fake illness, falsified records. It's not just betrayal, it's a felony. We barely made it down the courthouse steps when my phone rang again. Sarah. Her voice was breathless. Mrs. Thompson, they're here early. The lawyer just arrived. It's only noon. My pulse quickened. What kind of documents? I couldn't see all of them, but there's a thick stack business transfer papers, maybe more. And Mrs. Thompson... Richard's up and walking around. He's not even pretending to be sick. The fury that rose inside me was so pure it was almost cold. Can you get close enough to take photos? I asked. I'll try, she said. But if they catch me, they won't. I cut in. And Sarah, whatever happens, you stay safe. Promise me. She hesitated. I promise. Then the line went dead. I turned to Margaret, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. They're signing the papers right now. She smiled grimly. Then it's a good thing we filed first. Those documents will be worthless in an hour. She checked her watch. The process server is already en route to the hospital. For 45 endless minutes, I paced the courthouse parking lot, my heart ricocheting between fury and anticipation. Then my phone rang again. Mrs. Thompson, a deep male voice, said, "This is Tom Bradley, process server. I just delivered the divorce papers to your husband at Denver General." "How did he take it?" I asked. Tom chuckled. "Ma'am, I've been doing this 15 years and I've never seen anyone turn that particular shade of purple before." He started shouting about some woman named Sophia and how it would ruin everything. The young blonde with him ran out of there like her shoes were on fire, left a whole stack of papers behind. I thanked him and hung up, savoring a quiet, fierce satisfaction. For the first time in days, I felt the balance of power shift. Minutes later, another text came through Sarah again. "You need to see this. Coming to meet you. Richard is losing his mind." 20 minutes later, she slipped into the coffee shop across from the courthouse, hair disheveled, still in her scrubs. She looked like she'd just walked through a storm. I got photos before Sophia dropped the documents, she said, pulling out her phone. My stomach twisted as she showed me the images, legal transfers of every property I owned, incorporation papers for a company called Thompson Holdings, listing Richard and Sophia as the only officers. But what froze me was the final page, a will supposedly mine, leaving everything to Richard in the event of my tragic suicide. "They even forged your signature," Sarah whispered. I stared at the neat handwriting that mimicked mine almost perfectly. "They wrote my suicide note," I said, my voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, her expression grim. and they were planning to do it this weekend. I heard them talking about the timeline. This weekend, my mind reeled. They were going to kill me this weekend. I felt the tremors start in my hands and spread up my arms until I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Then we're done waiting. I said finally, "It's time to call the police." Before I could dial, my phone vibrated again. Richard's name lit up the screen. Sarah's eyes widened. "Answer it," she mouthed. I hit accept. "Hello, darling," I said, sugarcoating every syllable. "You," he hissed through clenched teeth. "You conniving suspicious, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I have some idea," I replied, calm as ice. "Though I'd love to hear your version. 5 years of marriage. Maggie, and this is how you repay me. Having me served while I'm fighting for my life in a hospital bed," I almost laughed. "Fighting for your life." "Oh, Richard, please. I saw you walking around that room today. Unless medical science has made leaps, I missed you seem miraculously cured." Silence. Long, seething silence. Then I added softly, "You might also want to tell Sophia that forging signatures is a federal crime. The FBI takes that sort of thing very seriously." And then I hung up. Sarah stared at me as if she were seeing someone new. "What happens now?" she asked. I leaned back in my chair, heart finally steady. "Now," I said, "we make sure they pay for what they tried to do. Completely." But Richard and Sophia weren't finished yet. Not by a long shot. By that evening, I would discover that their little scheme went much deeper than fraud or betrayal. It was something darker, something that had been years in the making, and it was only just beginning to unravel. The next morning, I found myself sitting across from Detective Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose calm stare could have cut through glass. Her office at the Denver Police Department was small, but her presence filled it. Files were stacked like fortresses around her desk, a half-drunk coffee growing cold beside a case log. I'd brought everything: the forged documents, the photos Sarah had risked her job to take recordings of Richard's threatening calls, and the timeline I'd pieced together overnight. When I finished laying it all out, Elena leaned back and said, "Mrs. Thompson, this is one of the most elaborate financial and attempted murder conspiracies I've seen. Your husband wasn't planning a theft. He was planning the perfect crime." Her words made the air feel heavier. I stared down at my hands, steady now, no longer trembling. "How close did they come?" I asked. She exhaled through her nose, flipping through the stack of evidence. "Closer than you'd want to know. If you hadn't overheard them that day, if you hadn't filed when you did..." She trailed off, and for a moment I imagined the headlines. "Wealthy Denver businesswoman found dead in apparent suicide." The thought made my stomach twist. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now we arrest them," Elena said matter-of-factly. "The evidence is solid fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder. They won't be walking free for long." It should have felt like victory, but what I felt instead was something emptier, a cold echo where love used to live. That afternoon, I sat by the window of my living room as 2 police cruisers rolled into my driveway. Not for me. For him. Detective Rodriguez led the search of my home office, carefully boxing up Richard's files, photographing everything. It was surreal watching strangers move through the same space where I'd once built my dreams. The place where Richard had stood behind me, hands on my shoulders, whispering how proud he was of what we'd created together. I didn't know then that even those moments were rehearsed part of a long game designed to end with my signature, my fortune, and my death. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Rodriguez called, emerging from the office with a laptop in hand. "We found this hidden in your husband's desk. You might want to see this." She turned the screen toward me, emails, hundreds of them between Richard and Sophia, dating back more than a year before his so-called cardiac episode. Plans, transfers, conversations about my businesses, my routines, my accounts, even casual talk about me. She still thinks I'm in love with her one email read. God, she's so easy to play. I didn't cry. I just felt something inside me go very, very still. It didn't stop there. Rodriguez scrolled to a folder labeled Insurance Policies. Inside were scanned documents I'd never seen before, life insurance policies, taken out in my name 6 months earlier, totaling $12 million. Richard was the sole beneficiary. I never signed these. I whispered, tracing the forged signature that looked so disturbingly like my own. "We didn't think so," Rodriguez said. "Your husband was thorough. Too thorough. But we've confirmed with all 3 insurance companies they were fakes. Forged paperwork, falsified witness signatures. He planned to collect the payout after your suicide." I pressed my palm to my mouth. He'd planned every angle. The crime scene, the paperwork, the motive, even my obituary. "How do people like him exist?" I asked quietly. "Smart men without consciences," Rodriguez said. "But they usually slip up when they start thinking they're untouchable." Later that night, after the officers left, I poured myself another drink and walked through the echoing quiet of my house. Every room felt haunted not by ghosts, but by memories of my own blindness. The dinner parties, the shared jokes, the way he'd rest his hand on my back at charity galas, like a man proud of his wife. It had all been an act. He'd studied me, mimicked my language, mirrored my ambitions. He'd built trust the way con artists build scaffolding, one careful lie at a time. The next day, Margaret called. Her voice was brisk but laced with satisfaction. "It's over. The judge froze all assets this morning. Richard can't touch a penny." Then after a pause, "Maggie, there's more. He's been siphoning money from your accounts for 2 years. Small amounts just under reporting thresholds, but it totals nearly $400,000. I closed my eyes, exhaling through clenched teeth. "That man's greed has no floor." "No," she said, "but it will have a ceiling. We can trace every transfer. He'll be charged for every cent." By the time the sun set that evening, the news broke: Denver real estate investor arrested in elaborate fraud scheme. The photos showed Richard in handcuffs, head bowed, hair disheveled. Sophia was arrested hours later, caught in her apartment, surrounded by documents she'd tried and failed to shred. My phone buzzed with calls from reporters, old colleagues, even family I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted the same thing, the story. But all I wanted was silence. That night, I sat on my deck overlooking the glittering city lights. Somewhere out there, Richard was in a cell, probably still convinced he'd find a way out. Men like him always thought they could. I thought about Sarah, whose courage had saved my life, and about how I'd once mistaken control for love. Richard had gambled that I'd be too soft to fight back. He'd been wrong. He'd bet everything on my death, and I'd turned it into the reason I was still standing. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "This isn't over. I'll make you pay for this. Sophia, out on bail and still stupid enough to threaten me." I smiled faintly and forwarded the message to Detective Rodriguez. Then I typed back, "Looking forward to it. By the way, threatening a witness is another felony. See you in court." 3 minutes later, my phone rang again. Rodriguez's calm voice on the line. "Officers are on their way, Mrs. Thompson. We'll have her bail revoked within the hour. Some criminals just can't help making our jobs easier." I watched the lights of Denver shimmer below and thought for the first time in years that I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of losing, not of being alone, not of starting over. Because what Richard had tried to destroy wasn't just my fortune, it was my will to live. And that was the one thing he could never take. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where everything had begun, only this time I wasn't trembling. I was calm. Richard sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his once silver hair now the color of ash. He looked smaller somehow, like the air had gone out of him. The judge's voice was steady as she read the sentence: 12 years in federal prison for fraud conspiracy and attempted murder. Sophia got 8. Watching her led away in handcuffs, I felt something that wasn't quite joy but close enough a deep resounding sense of justice clicking into place. But even as the gavel came down, I realized something strange. I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt sharpened, tempered by fire. I'd been forged into something stronger than I'd ever been when he stood beside me. Thompson Properties was thriving again. With Richard gone, my focus returned. In the months since his arrest, I'd bought 16 new buildings. My new property manager, Sarah Collins, yes, the same nurse who'd saved my life, had taken to business like she'd been born for it. Her hospital-honed patience translated beautifully into negotiating leases and dealing with difficult clients. 16 properties in 6 months, I said during our weekly meeting, raising an eyebrow. I thought we agreed to be conservative. She grinned, looking radiant in her navy blazer. We were. But when people heard about Richard's arrest, 3 of his former clients came straight to us. They wanted to offload their properties fast. We got the entire Harbor District portfolio for 60% of its assessed value. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading. So Richard's criminal legacy turned into a bargain sale. Poetic. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. Poetic and profitable. The Malibu house just sold $3.8 million, $400,000 over asking. Apparently, scandal sells in California. I thought about that house, the one I'd bought as an anniversary surprise, the one they'd planned to live in after my suicide. Now its sale was funding my next expansion. The universe has an impeccable sense of irony, I said, lifting my coffee in a mock toast. Any word from him? Sarah asked carefully. I nodded. He called your office, didn't he? She grimaced. Yesterday. A collect call from the federal penitentiary. He wanted to know if I'd consider visiting. And you said that threatening to kill my employer tends to make me uninterested in social visits. I laughed softly. God, it felt good to laugh again. Without Richard's constant doubts and manipulations, my business had soared. The divorce was finalized 3 months earlier. Thanks to Margaret's ruthless efficiency, every cent I'd earned was protected. Richard left the marriage with nothing, not even dignity. A knock on the door interrupted us. David, Sarah's assistant, peeked in. Detective Rodriguez is here, Mrs. Thompson. Elena Rodriguez walked in that same composed confidence in her stride. Over the months, she'd become more than an investigator, almost a friend. I have good news, she said, taking a seat. We found the rest of the money. What money, I asked. The funds Richard siphoned from your accounts. We traced them to offshore and crypto holdings. $800,000. All of it's been recovered with interest. I blinked. So the man who stole from me ended up making me richer. Elena smiled. Life's little irony. She hesitated, then added, There's more. Sophia's been trying to make a deal with prosecutors. She claims Richard was planning to kill her too after the transfers were complete. My eyebrows rose. Do you believe her? Actually, yes. We found searches on his laptop for untraceable poisons and staged drownings. It looks like she was just another name on his list. I stared at the floor, the realization chilling me more than I expected. Even she, the woman who'd conspired with him to kill me, had almost become his next victim. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office surrounded by the soft hum of the city beyond my windows, thinking about how close I'd come to disappearing, all because I'd fallen for a man who saw love as leverage. My phone rang near midnight. The number was international. Mrs. Thompson, a woman's voice, said, British trembling slightly. My name is Catherine Walsh. I'm calling from London. I saw the news about your husband's conviction. I frowned. Yes, because I believe Richard Thompson killed my sister. The silence that followed was deafening. Your sister, I repeated slowly. My sister, Emma Walsh. She died in Phoenix 15 years ago. It was ruled a suicide, but my family never believed it. When I saw your husband's photo, I knew. It's him. He was married to Emma under another name. I felt my hand tighten around the phone. You're saying Richard was married before married, yes, and I believe he murdered her for her inheritance. My throat went dry. How do you know? Catherine's voice shook, but her conviction didn't. Because I've been tracking him for 15 years. Your husband, Mrs. Thompson, is a serial killer. I sat there in the darkness, the city lights painting faint gold streaks across my desk. My pulse thundered in my ears. The man who had tried to kill me hadn't just been greedy, he'd been hunting women for decades. Are you certain? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I am. I've gathered everything, photos, documents, marriage records under aliases. He changes his name every few years, moves, state starts over. You were his next target, but you survived. Catherine's voice softened. He underestimated you. You stopped him. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from a dawning, furious clarity. Catherine, I said, finally, if what you're saying is true, we're not finished. Not yet. Then will you help me? She asked quietly. To finally get justice for Emma, I looked at the framed photo on my desk, my first property, the one I'd restored with my own hands. The start of everything. Yes, I said, my voice firm. I'll help you destroy him. Completely. I didn't know it then, but the story wasn't over. The deeper we dug, the darker it got. Richard's crimes stretched across states and decades, leaving a trail of women who'd all made the same mistake I had, believing his charm was love. I'd thought surviving him was my victory, but what came next would show me that justice, real justice, was far bigger than my story alone. The investigation that followed spread like cracks through glass, slow at first, then unstoppable. For 3 months, Detective Rodriguez worked with law enforcement across 5 states, piecing together what Catherine Walsh had suspected for years. The files filled an entire conference table. Names, photographs, wedding certificates, death certificates. 6 women in total. Emma Walsh, Phoenix, 2009. Linda Martinez, San Antonio, 2011. Carol Stevens, Austin, 2013. Jennifer Burke, Oklahoma City, 2016. Michelle Davis, Kansas City, 2018. And me, Margaret Thompson, Denver, 2024, the one who survived. They'd all been the same type, successful, independent women in their 50s and 60s, women who built something of their own and thought they were safe. Each one had met a charming man with a warm smile and practiced empathy. Each had married him within a year. And within another year, they were gone. Accidents, suicides, heart failure. Every death tidy, explainable, profitable. Elena's voice was steady as she slid the evidence toward me. He learned from every kill, changed names, states, even accents, but his pattern never changed. Find wealth, create trust, take control, kill clean. I stared at the photos of the women spread before me. They looked like snapshots of alternate lives, different faces, same story. He was studying us, I whispered. All of us. Elena nodded. For 5 years before he ever met you, he watched your interviews, your charity events, even your renovation projects. He knew your routines down to when you got your morning coffee. I pressed my palms flat on the table, feeling a chill creep up my spine. So every kind word, every glance, every kiss. My voice faltered. All of it was research. A week later, Catherine flew in from London. When I met her at a small cafe downtown, it felt like seeing a reflection of my own grief. She was a lawyer, sharp, meticulous, yet her eyes carried the same quiet ache mine had 6 months ago. Emma was everything to me, she said, wrapping her hands around her teacup as if trying to warm herself. She was brilliant, independent, and when she met Richard, she said he was the first man who didn't make her feel small. I swallowed hard. He knew how to say exactly what you needed to hear. Catherine nodded. He convinced her to combine their assets. 3 weeks before she died, she called me, said something didn't feel right, that she was going to see a lawyer. The next morning, she was gone. Her voice broke. They said she jumped, but Emma was afraid of heights. That night, I got a call from a federal prison liaison. "Mrs. Thompson, your ex-husband wants to see you," the woman said. My first instinct was laughter, a sharp, bitter sound. He wants me. He claims to have information about other crimes. He says he'll only share it with you. I thought about it for a long time before I agreed. Not out of compassion, out of purpose. 2 days later, I sat across from Richard Thompson in a gray visiting room that smelled faintly of bleach and regret. He looked hollowed out, older than his 60 years' eyes, darting like a man who'd learned the hard way that he wasn't the smartest person in the room anymore. "Hello, Maggie," he said softly. "Richard." My tone was flat, cold as marble. "You said you had something to tell me." He gave a tired, almost wistful smile. "I suppose you're here to gloat." "No," I said. "I'm here because you might help close the door on the women you killed." His eyes flickered. "You think I killed them all?" I didn't blink. "I know you did." He sighed. "I didn't want it to go this far. Not with you. You were different." I almost laughed. "Different? I cared about you," he said. "I never planned to murder me." I cut in. "Richard, you forged my will. You wrote my suicide note. How exactly was that different?" He looked down, rubbing the chains on his wrists as if they were rosary beads. "I suppose I got used to winning, to control." It stopped feeling real after the first time. His voice softened, almost confessional. "You were the first one who fought back." "You mean the first one who didn't die," I said. He nodded faintly. Then, in a low, resigned tone, he began to talk. For 2 hours, he confessed in a way that made my blood run cold. Every woman, every calculated move, how he studied their weaknesses, their loneliness, their desire to be understood, how he practiced the perfect proposal speech until he could deliver it like theater. And when the time came, how he made each death look like grief. When it was over, I stood to leave. "Why tell me all this now?" I asked. Because he said, eyes hollow, I want it to mean something. "It won't," I replied. "Nothing you do ever will." He hesitated, then asked softly, "Did you ever love me?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I loved who you pretended to be." Then I turned and walked out without looking back. 3 weeks later, Richard pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for life without parole. Catherine called me from London the day the verdict was announced. "It's over," she said, her voice shaking. "After 15 years, my sister finally has justice." I felt a lump in my throat I hadn't expected. "You helped me get mine," I told her. "Maybe we both found our way out." 6 months later, Thompson Properties had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. $83 million in assets. Offices in Denver, Phoenix, Austin, and Oklahoma City, the same cities where Richard's victims had lived and died. But now those offices did more than sell real estate. They funded shelter scholarships and small business grants for women starting over after loss. I called it the Emma Foundation. Sarah Collins was still with me now, managing entire regions. Her son Jake had just been accepted to MIT. "You've changed his life," she said one morning, tears glinting in her eyes. I smiled. "You changed mine first." That evening, I sat on my deck with a glass of wine, watching the Colorado sky fade into indigo. My phone buzzed. A text from Detective Rodriguez. "Richard Thompson died today. Heart attack. Thought you'd want to know." For a long time, I just stared at it. No joy, no sorrow, just peace. Catherine called a few minutes later. "I saw the news," she said quietly. "How do you feel?" I looked out at the mountains, their edges softened by dusk. "Like I can finally stop looking over my shoulder," I said. "Like Emma can finally rest." When I hung up, the house was silent except for the hum of the wind. I walked through each room, my rooms touching the furniture, the walls, the details I'd chosen. Every piece was mine again, cleansed of deceit. I thought about all the women who never got this chance, and the small miracle that I had. Richard had bet everything on my death. I'd bet everything on my life and I'd won. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what strength means to you. Sometimes survival isn't about what you escape. It's about what you rebuild.